Welcome to today's lecturette. I'm Dr. Leslie Jones, and today we're going to be continuing our discussion on children who are living in the fragile context of disadvantage. In our last lecturette, we explored the concept of disadvantage and how it is defined and measured by governments and support agencies. And we made the point that employing targeted support responses in communities affected by disadvantage is a critical enabler to addressing the impacts of that disadvantage. So in today's lecturette, we're going to be exploring some working examples of how government and communities are implementing some initiatives in targeted communities to address the complex and multidimensional aspects of community disadvantage. And so, as we begin to consider how communities might develop their responses to disadvantage, this little quote from your text is a nice way to begin our thinking today. And it states that risks for disadvantage rarely arrive alone. They come in pairs and clumps and basketfuls, and they're tangled up like yarn. And when we think about disadvantage as being this complex, multi-dimensional sort of issue that communities have to address, we start to then think about, so what are the challenges in addressing disadvantage, but what are also some of the opportunities that we can think about disadvantage differently? And so some of the challenges that we can see in community responses is first and foremost disciplinary silos. There are lots of agencies that work in communities around disadvantage, and historically they tend to work very separate from one another. So that can create tensions around things like competition for funding, not sharing information terribly well, having different agendas to support families that need to be actually integrated, not separated. And then there's also the conditions for effective support that Canier and Kramer identify. Things like having shared agendas is difficult. Even having separate agencies talk a common language about disadvantage can be a problem. And so we also need to know that when people are working together, it's challenging for them to even talk about disadvantage and measure impact about disadvantage in the same ways. And of course, there's a challenge around translating policy into practice and avoiding the stereotypes and a deficit model when we're thinking about disadvantage in our local communities, particularly for those hard-to-reach families that can so easily be stereotyped into a particular view where children and families are positioned in a very deficit model. And then the institutional structures that we have historically held children around. How are children positioned? How are children allowed to participate in their own communities around addressing areas and situations of disadvantage? Beyond the challenges, there are also opportunities as contemporary models for service support begin to redefine how we think about disadvantage. And we've seen a massive increase in services that would now be considered wraparound services. So as opposed to disciplinary silos, wraparound services such as the Parents Under Pressure program, for instance, really look at how they integrate services and put a holistic framework of support around communities and families experiencing disadvantage. There's also been new work done in what's now known as prevention science. So things like the CREATE model and Act for Kids and many more, where we're trying to really redefine what is early intervention looking like. How do we build capability and capacity in communities to get in front of disadvantage before it starts to have a negative impact on children's development and family life? And of course, there's a shifting focus around thinking around forms of social exclusion. So broadening the understanding around what makes and constitutes disadvantage, and therefore broadening the support and the intervention that communities have access to and the responses that communities actually develop. And then the shifting focus around looking at very targeted programs rather than just universal programs for communities and families experiencing disadvantage, so that we're getting deeply embedded within communities to make sure that we're providing the right type of service support to the right people at the right time. And of course, there's been a massive opportunity, as in contemporary practice, we redefine how children themselves participate. And we think about the recognition of their capability and capacity in documents such as the EYLF, for instance, and the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child. It has helped communities redefine just exactly what sort of collaboration and participation is possible when we start involving children's voice directly and families' voice directly in supporting their own communities through periods of disadvantage. And then, of course, there are opportunities with the changing focus around the government mandates that we get. So, for example, the public health 3Ps of promote, prevent, and protect. So we're getting that macro system focus around targeted responses for disadvantage that are shifting it away from a welfare state to something being far more proactive for families and communities that are doing it tough. I'd now like to share some specific examples of community responses to disadvantage that are really good examples of how communities and governments have marshalled together to address issues of disadvantage. And the first one that I'd like to talk to you about is the initiative BU and that of Kids Matter Early Childhood. So Kids Matter is a mental health and wellbeing initiative for primary school and early childhood education and care services, such as preschools, kindergartens and childcare centres. And it's about creating positive school and early childhood communities and teaching children skills for good social and emotional development. It's a program that is designed and targeted towards educators and teachers by providing professional development programs in an online environment that has resources and units of study that really focus on building children's resilience and community resilience in the face of disadvantage, and particular focus around mental health and well-being. So it's an online program that every educator in Australia can actually access. And I think the most important thing to remember out of programs like BU and Kids Matter that specifically have a focus around child mental health and wellbeing is how important that is to build resilience, and for children who are experiencing disadvantage and live in communities where there is broader senses of disadvantage. Having children with a robust sense of resilience and confidence and being mentally really healthy is a fantastic beginning place to be, and a really strong preventative piece of community work that is essential if we're going to really get in front of the game in terms of eliminating disadvantage, or at least minimising the impact of disadvantage for children and for families. The next example of a community response that I'd like to share with you is that of Logan Together. Logan Together is a community plan that has used impact planning and a multidisciplinary approach to support families at all the major milestones of family life in order to support positive outcomes for children and to disrupt disadvantage. So it's a preventative program by nature. And they've developed, the consortium has developed a roadmap that looks at the intersection points with families ready to have children, then off to a great start, so pregnancy and antenatal care, then the milestone of on track at 3, on track at 5, and on track at 8. And it's underpinned by family foundations and a very strong community and an integration of effective systems working together. And I think it's one of the a really good example of how this consortium of people have had a shared agenda from all sorts of different disciplines, from health, from social planning, from local council, through to early childhood providers, through to community agencies within the organisation, community clubs and associations have all come together under the one auspice and have worked together to build a shared agenda. And a really integrated, holistic, wraparound approach to supporting children and families living in the Logan catchment area right from before they've even had children, and really looking at what is the social and community infrastructure that's needed to make the best opportunities for families as they become families and as they progress through those first few early years. But also, what are then the programs that families need to access, and how does that get funded so that it's pulled together and really is a great example of that holistic wraparound community support that's been effective for the best part of a decade. And as a result, Logan Together has been really well recognised for the work that they've done in their local community, the holistic nature and the collaborative nature that underpins the entire program. And it's part of the reasons that it's applauded as being a successful community response to disadvantage. The next community response program that I'd like to discuss is one called Parents Under Pressure, or the PUP program. The PUP program is an incredibly detailed, intensive support program that is very targeted for families who are struggling to cope with the job of being parents. It combines psychological principles relating to parenting, child behavioural, and parental emotional regulation within a case management model. So, very, very targeted. The program is home based, so it happens in families' own homes, and is designed for families in which there are many difficult life circumstances that impact on family functioning. Such problems may include things like depression and anxiety, substance abuse, family conflict, and severe financial stress. The program is highly individualised to suit each family, so it's highly nuanced to deal with exactly the challenges that the family is experiencing and the disadvantage that they're suffering through. There are 12 modules in all in the PUP program that parents work through. The first module is one of assessment, where parents aim to identify the diverse problems that they may be facing, and clinicians help parents understand how these may be impacting on their parenting. So, in doing that, the clinician and the parents build a shared agenda. The remaining modules in the PUP program cover off things like setting goals, looking at the view of themselves as parents, managing emotion under pressure, health checks for children and the parents' role within that, being able to better connect with children as parents, and the introduction of mindful play with children, focusing around also things like appropriate child management and guidance strategies, managing substance abuse as an adult, because many parents who engage with the PUP program have that as part of their past experiences. And then looking at things like being able to extend their supportive networks in community and to be able to be confident in more complex social situations, and redefining how those social interactions and social networks actually work. And also some really practical things like providing parents with the skills around some pretty basic life skills that may be missing. Things like information about nutrition, being able to cook healthy meals, being able to run a family budget, and being able to access government services such as housing, for instance. And another module around just redefining relationships and relating to each other within the family unit. So, as an overall program, this is an incredibly targeted program that is a really good example of how a very intense program can be delivered to a family directly in their own home for the highest level of impact around resilience and well-being, and coping with quite significant levels of disadvantage. The Creating Pathways to Prevention community program was based in Queensland, and is another really lovely example of a preventative program that ran in some pretty disadvantaged areas in Queensland and Brisbane for over a decade. And the program itself had a very holistic approach and really looked at the systems connections points that had an impact around child development. So really looking at those meso and exosystems and the way that they work together around influencing child development. And so it had an overarching focus around really looking at the better the individual outcomes are achieved by enriching all the relevant developmental settings that children access, especially looking at the family context and schooling context and early childhood contexts. So within its universal focus, the Pathways model emphasised comprehensive and integrated practice that supported child development in a very holistic way. And the overriding goal was to create a pathway to wellbeing for all local children as they transited through successive life phases, from birth through to youth, so very similar to Logan Together. And some of those key features of the program included things like interventions in one context, so at home, should have to interact with and complement and support the interventions in other contexts, so for instance at school or daycare. So that real notion around the cross collaboration and building that holistic support for families, no matter if their children were at home or at school or at daycare. And a real focus around relationships and the trust and cooperation between the staff of the programs and the families, where everyone was valued equally. And then a focus around that the intervention effects were enhanced by focusing on the life transition points. So being really mindful about where and when support was offered to families. So really making sure that those tricky transitions, such as starting school, there was adequate support for vulnerable families to make sure that those transition points were well supported and effective. So it was a successful program that really showed the strength of a holistic, multidisciplinary approach to supporting families who were living in quite significant circumstances of disadvantage, to reduce the impact of that disadvantage for children as they grew through from infancy through to youth. A long-standing and well-known community program in Australia working in disadvantaged communities is that of Communities for Children. Communities for Children is a strategy that encourages healthy community environments for disadvantaged children. It is an initiative of the federal government, of Department of Families, Housing, Community Services and Indigenous Affairs, and is part of the Family Support Program. A key local non-government organisation called a facilitating partner in each site acts as a broker in engaging smaller local organisations to deliver a range of activities in their communities focused on enhancing child development and redressing aspects of disadvantage. The facilitating partner oversees the development, implementation and funding allocations for activities and strategies in the community. Funding is mostly allocated to local service providers who deliver the activities. And an example of some of the activities being implemented under Communities for Children include things like home visiting for clinicians and educators to go to children's homes to start to understand the home context of children better. Early learning literacy programs, again delivered in hub situations or in early learning programs themselves, or in libraries and community facilities. Early development of social and communication skills, parenting and family support programs, programs on child nutrition, and some community events to celebrate the importance of children and families in the early years. Some of the facilitating partners that we see in Communities for Children catchment areas include some of our major charities. So people like the Salvation Army, the Smith family, the Benevolent Society, Mission Australia, those larger organisations who are well resourced to create and fund and support the initiatives under Communities for Children. Communities for Children is really highly regarded in terms of its impact in communities where disadvantage is a real issue for child development. So this community support program delivered by Good Start Early Learning under their ECHO service program is an interesting example of a service provider, admittedly Australia's largest service provider, developing their own initiatives to address community levels of disadvantage. So ECHO services are part of their childcare network. They are selected services that are situated in communities where they know that conditions of disadvantage exist. And within those services, the services become the hub with spokes of support sitting around a holistic approach around the services. So ancillary service providers work alongside educators in those local contexts. So people like speech pathologists, occupational therapists, family and community and child practitioners, child psychologists, and a whole range of ancillary service providers who work in collaboration and consultation with the Early Learning Centre to build the capability and capacity of educators working day to day with those children in that local community. So it's a strength-based model and it's not a clinician model. So the OTs and the speechies don't actually work with the children per se. They work rather with the educators and teachers working in the centre to give them the skills and capability to support early intervention and good practice with those children working in local communities where disadvantage actually exists. It's a successful model, and it's one where we can capillarise the impact of good early intervention practices to much broader audiences where we know that the impact is really necessary. Living and growing up in disadvantage is a real reality for some Australian children. Not every Australian obviously lives in disadvantage, but we know that for those who do, the impacts can be lifelong and very detrimental. And we know that in order to respond effectively to disadvantage, we need our governments and our local communities to marshal the necessary resources and infrastructure to ensure that the impacts of disadvantage in communities is mitigated by efficacious and impactful local-based community programs. We know that we need both universal and targeted approaches to dealing with disadvantage, and we need to ensure that the community is fully engaged in the development and implementation of programs that make sense in their local communities. As a working professional, you will undoubtedly deal with and support families who are experiencing disadvantage. Knowing what sort of support and community programs are available in your local context is a critical enabler and support mechanism for the families that you will be working with and the children that you will be supporting. Thank you for joining me in this lecturette. I look forward to our next session together as we continue our discussion on children, families and community.